So here's what we're doing today. We're gonna lead off with a month-long new series that we're calling Secret Sauce. All right? Because there's a secret sauce to doing life together, and you might have been able to kind of sense it or put your finger on it because not every community has the secret sauce. You know what I mean by that? I mean, have you ever been a part of a community, a group of people, whether it be your own personal family, or a workplace environment, or a school environment, or a neighborhood, or a church, where you walked in and you're like, there's life in this place. You can feel it, you can smell it. And there's other groups, no names mentioned, right, that you've been a part of those groups, and it had a different kind of smell. Like, there's some groups that you want to be a part of, and there's other groups that you, like, have to be a part of, right? We used to call those in high school, like, those were community or group projects, right? No, not a group project. Because you know you're going to have one or two people who just contribute nothing to that, and you're like, there's not a lot of life in this community. A couple things about this. There's some communities that have longevity, and there's other groups that kind of flare up real quick, and then they flame out. There's just not a lot of substance to them. Some groups, they just love winning together. You see the Astros when they won? They're all excited. You see the Dodgers when they win? There's great community life together. Did you hear the report about the Chicago Bulls before their season started? Between teammates, there's a conflict during practice. One of them punches another guy in the face, breaks some bones in his face, and I don't know if he's out for the whole season. He's out for a long time, though. Not a lot of community life at the Chicago Bulls right now, right? Other people, when they get to be a part of a group, they just love each other. They support each other. But other communities who don't have the secret sauce, when they get together, there's just constant conflict. Have you been a part of those groups? Here's the truth. Every single person wants to be a part of a great community. And it starts with this. Everybody wants to belong to a great family. And maybe you grew up in the kind of family that you're like, that's not the kind of family you want to belong to. You started your own family. You're like, I'm going to do it different than how I was raised because, man, I really want this for me and I want it for my family. Some of y'all belong to churches in the past. You're like, it was a great community or maybe it was a bad community, and you're luckily you came back to another church to try and find a better community. Sometimes it's in your neighborhood. You're like, we have the best neighbors. We sit out on the porch and spend time together. Or we do neighborhood block parties, whatever it is. Some of you have these great communities. Maybe it's honestly your workplace, that you just have a sense of team there. Maybe you belong to a men's group, a women's group. Maybe your community group is that kind of community. Here's what I know. Everybody wants it. Everybody wants that sense of belonging, but not just to any old community. We all want to belong to a great community. But the truth is this. I think it's rare that a group of people is able to distinguish what the secret sauce is that makes a community great and attractive and effective with longevity. I think most people go through their whole lives and rarely ever experience it. Now, there's some factors to it. Let me just give you a couple factors. One is this. When the team is winning, it's fun to be a part of, right? Sometimes it's newness. Oh, there's just newness to it. It's great to be a part of a community that's new. But then after a month, it kind of fades and wears off because there's not a lot of substance to the group. Sometimes if you have a lot in common with the people, you're like, oh, we can actually do stuff together because we have a lot in common. That can be a big factor. Maybe it's a community cause. Oh, we serve other people together, and so there's a lot of camaraderie. Some of you felt it yesterday when you were helping out, serving together. You're like, man, people that work together, they stay together. I mean, there's just a lot of camaraderie there. For others of you, what it takes to make a great community is a common enemy. If y'all just hate the same people, like there's a lot of energy in that, right? I'm not saying that that's where we're headed. All of those are factors, but underneath that, I think there's a secret sauce. I think there's one component that really breathes life, longevity, and joy into a group of people. And I think you probably realize this today. We're a church. We're a community of people. Is there life here? Is there joy here? Is there longevity here? Well, there's definitely longevity. There's 167 years that this church has been around. But I'll tell you this, there hasn't always been joy. There hasn't always been life. There hasn't always been the fun, attractive community. but I think it's here today. But what's the secret sauce to it? Here's what I want to do. We're going to take a look in Matthew chapter 18. So open your Bibles, look at Matthew 18. We're going to look at two things. We'll get to the secret sauce in just a moment. But the community of Jesus' people, he has these disciples following him around for more than a year, maybe 2 years at this point. They're following him around. They're a group. They're definitely a group, but is there life there? One of the disciples, actually all of them, come to Jesus and ask him a question that reveals this. That group was not healthy. They were absolutely dysfunctional, and it's revealed in this question. It's Matthew 18, verse 1. It says this, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" It's an interesting question. Hey, Jesus, who's the greatest among us? They're essentially asking this. Jesus, who do you like better? Who's your favorite? John? James? Peter? Who's more important? Jesus, who's more valuable? Jesus, who's on the honor roll? Hey, Jesus, who's top dog? Whoa, wait. Now, Jesus, I know you're the Son of God, so you're top dog, but I just want to know who's next. And by the way, Jesus, out of the 12, who's last? Jesus, would you put us in a pecking order? Because we want to know, what's the status of the group? I'm going to tell you this. That question reveals this. The followers of Jesus at this point in time, in this story, have an unhealthy fascination with status. And it's been brewing for a couple of chapters. And I'm going to back up. Go to chapter 16. I'm going to back up and show you where this all starts brewing, because they have a really unhealthy fascination and fixation with status. And I'm guessing this. Their fixation on it is probably no different than our unhealthy fixation on it. And hear me. Status, our ability to deal with it, our over-fixation on it, breeds a really unhealthy community. It's the opposite, actually, of the secret sauce. So let's take a look at this. Go back to chapter 16, verse 17. Jesus asked the disciples, okay? You go back, chapter 16, Matthew, okay? Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they kind of banter around with some ideas. And Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah." Verse 17, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then in verse 17, Jesus responds to Peter. Peter gets it right. Think for a minute. There's 12 disciples there, and Peter gets the answer right. You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Listen to Jesus' remarks. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." Let me translate that for you. "Favored are you. Honored are you." And can you see Peter with the other 12 standing around? He just stands a little bit taller. He's like, "Yeah, blessed is me." It's in the text just loosely, okay? "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was revealed to you not by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Wait. On me? On Peter? Now, there's a translation there that says, well, is it really on Peter, the person, or is it on the statement he made on "You're Jesus the Messiah"? Either way, he got the answer right. Peter has a designation in this moment at this time that he might be a little bit above the rest of the disciples. Here's why I think that. Look at the very next line. He says in verse 19, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." I don't think Peter had any idea what that meant, but he looked at the other disciples like, "I got the keys to the kingdom of heaven." It's not a figurative key. And he said, "I will give it to you later on." He doesn't understand what that means, but it doesn't matter, because there's the 11 and then there's Peter. There's a status change in the room. Now, the problem is this. When people get overly fixated on status, this is in your notes, we mistakenly connect roles with value. Why would they, in the near future, ask the question, "Hey, Jesus, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Why were they preoccupied with status? Because the disciples are no different than you and I are. When the status changes, when the role changes, when the position changes, all of a sudden we start attaching value to it. Think about it this way. You're in the elevator at work. I don't know if your work has an elevator, right? But pretend it does. You have an elevator at work. A couple of VPs step in. You move to the back of the elevator. How are you feeling right now? What do you say in that moment? Do you address them? Do you talk to them? How do you feel about yourself? Do you shrink back? They get out at the next floor. income people who, I don't know, maybe they clean the facility every night and they're coming off their shift and they walk in, got a mop and a broom, and how do you feel? Do you talk to them? Do you say hi? Are you too much above them to say hi? Listen, we treat people different all the time based off of their status. The little name badge, whether they have one or not, based off of the initials that end their name and the degrees that they have. Peter, in this moment, has this elevated place amongst the other disciples. And I don't think they're any different than we are, that we get hung up on what status looks like. No. Peter got knocked down a little bit in just the next couple sentences where Jesus says, by the way, I'm going to go and we're going to all go to Jerusalem. And by the way, the Son of Man is going to die. He's referring to himself. He's saying, I'm going to go die on a cross. And Peter goes, never. We are never going to go die on a cross. And then Jesus utters those famous words, get behind me, Satan. Can you hear the disciples snicker? Hey, Mr. Keys to the kingdom. Or should we call you Satan? He gets flattened out just a little bit. Probably for his own good. This story is interesting because it continues. Jesus says, let me tell you what it looks like to follow me. Under point number 2, Jesus continues on. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. That doesn't sound easy. Take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. So he's saying, this is my journey to the cross. And he's saying, listen, your journey is going to be about self-sacrifice as well. Look at verse 27. Then he says, for the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels. And then, here it is, ready? Then here's what's going to happen at the end. He will reward each person according to what they have done. Think about it. He's looking at his 12. He's like, here's what I'm going to do. After it's all said and done, you're going to get a reward. It's going to be based off of what you have done. Are there any competitive people in the room right now? Raise your hand. See, the really competitive, you raised your hand and looked around. Was I first? I think I was first. Hope Pastor saw. There's others of you that are not competitive at all. And this might not make sense to you. You might read this and you read the words of Jesus, and he will reward each person according to what they've done. And you're like, oh, I might get a reward. That's great. You're like my niece Kendall. Is she 8 now? 9? Somewhere in that neighborhood? She's not competitive. Her mom is uber competitive. Colette is my younger sister, and Colette has a daughter named Kendall. And, my sister would coach her soccer team sometimes, and she did it for a season. Well, Kendall's not competitive. She would tell her, Kendall, see that girl out there? I know she's your friend. She's on the other team. Go steal the ball. Mom, I can't steal the ball from her. She's my friend. Like, for those of you that are like Kendall, this verse might not make any sense to you of like, oh, great, everybody gets a reward. And then to those of us who are human and a little more competitive, the reality is this, is when we read this, we go, okay, so there's rewards, all right? I don't really care what my reward is in the end, as long as it's better than his, and maybe just a little bit behind hers, right? Think about it this way. You get a check at the end of the year, a bonus, right? And you're like, oh, that's my bonus. What makes you feel better or worse about your bonus? Come on, how it stacks up to everybody else's, right? Because you know that there's going to be a conversation in the coffee room later on about, you're not going to ask them what they got, right? But somehow you're going to try and like figure that out about like, Jelly of the Month Club? Ha! And you got some big financial bonus. We feel better if it's better than theirs. We feel worse if someone got more than us. Why? Because we're competitive. You know why? What competitive people do? Competitive people compare rewards. It's because we're overly fixated on status. You know what that comes from? A scarcity mentality. It says there's only so much to go around. If he got more, I'm going to get less. Think about this. Jesus says there's going to be a reward at the end. Do you think he's going to run out of rewards? He's like, sorry, Scott. I would have given you more. But your wife, Kelly, she earned way more rewards than you. Competitive people, they compare. And honestly, comparison is the enemy of community. You know why? You can't celebrate when someone else wins. When someone else does something great, you struggle to cheer for them because you're asking the question, does anyone cheer for me? I wonder if anyone notices, well, I could have done that. Yeah, but you didn't. They did. Just celebrate for them, and it's not about you. And when someone's mourning and you're a person of comparison, you're just saying, I can't come alongside you to mourn with you because I'm just glad I'm not you. Competitive people compare rewards sometimes. They also compare misery. But the problem is, it does not lead to the secret sauce that makes comparison great. Listen to the voice of comparison. It says a bunch of things, but let me just give you two of them. One voice of comparison says this, and maybe you've thought this. I will never be as good as, fill in the blank. I'll never be as good as my dad or mom wants me to be. I'll never be as good as my sibling. I'll never be as good as that coworker. I'll never be as good as that person in my community group. And you live your life feeling less than, which means you can't walk into a community and just be yourself because you feel less than. Here's another voice. It's a totally opposite voice. It says, at least I'm not like so-and-so. Man, my life isn't totally great, but at least I'm not them. And somehow in our life, we compare ourselves to people so that we're not the greatest, but we're not the worst, and so therefore we feel better about ourselves. This happens in a community group of people that is overly fixated on our status. So we compare with each other, but comparison is the enemy of community. Third thing, 6 days after Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, he takes them on a retreat, okay? He takes the 3 and he leaves behind the 9. This is the story. Check it out. It's right in chapter 17, verse 1. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And he led them up on a high mountain by themselves. There he was, and here it is, okay? There he was transfigured before them. And you're like, what does that mean, transfigured? The next couple verses try to describe this. Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Think about this. He takes 3 of them. 9 of them are left behind. They go up the mountain and they see a miracle. Supernaturally, something happens to Jesus' face and his clothes and his body. And then appears this image of Elijah and Moses. And they're all up. Then right afterwards, I didn't read this part of the story, but then they hear the voice of God that says, this is my son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen, if you're one of the 3, what are you thinking? At least I'm not the 9. Because the other 9 are down there, and we got to see this unbelievable miracle. And to make it worse, when they're coming down the mountain, Jesus tells them, hey, by the way, don't tell anybody about this. Can you imagine Jesus, Peter, James, and John walking back into camp, and the other 9 are like, okay, so what happened? Jesus walks away, it's just Peter, James, and John, and then the other 9, like, so what happened? Like, well, we can't tell you. Jesus said not to. It's just between the 4 of us. Hey, there's a status here amongst these disciples that, listen, I can hear them already. The other 9, they're going to say, but that's not. To which every parent says, life's not. But how come you and we think life should be fair? We don't rejoice with those who something goes incredibly well for, and we're just really glad we're not the person who's suffering. Life isn't fair. Jesus in no way, shape, or form is here trying to create fairness amongst his people. And yet there's something about the secret sauce of community that we haven't talked about yet that goes right against this whole fairness concept. Fairness isn't even a thought of people who know the secret sauce. It happens in families when siblings feel like they've been treated differently by their parents. It happens in the workplace when people feel like other people have been given more opportunity. It happens in churches when people don't get invited to the right community group or feel like they didn't get invited to the leadership table that they should have. We want our fair share, our fair opportunity, even though we know life isn't fair. It's because we're overly fixated on status. What if we just ask the question, who cares about my title, my position, or what table I was invited to? My job, what I want to do is I want to be influential and helpful. What if we just ask that question? Let me give you a 4th thing. most of the time we measure our value by our accomplishments. Let me show you what happens here. In chapter 17, verse 14, I'll just tell you this story. A man brings his son to the disciples and says, "My son has seizures. Would you heal him?" Now, they've watched Jesus do miracles. They've even performed miracles in Jesus' name up to this point. And this man brings him his son and says, "Hey, would you heal him?" They pray over the son. The son doesn't get better. The dad brings the son to Jesus and says, "Listen, your disciples failed." It's a loose translation, okay? Your disciples failed. They couldn't heal him. And Jesus is like, "Okay, bring me your son." He heals the son. And the disciples come to him later and say, "Why couldn't we do that? Why couldn't we heal him?" And Jesus comments about their faith. He just says, "You've had so little faith." And maybe it was the first time that the disciples realized that failure was an option. Like they could step into this role of following Jesus where they're learning to do things like him and become like him. And they're really trying to become more like Jesus. And he endows them with unbelievable power. But at this moment, like they didn't have it. And they realized that failure was absolutely an option. And because of that, I think sometimes our value comes in what we've accomplished. They failed. And all of a sudden they start looking at each other, well, what did this guy accomplish over here? Well, I know I didn't do well at this miracle, but hey, I got to do that miracle over here. And we're back to comparison again. Don't you value the contributions that you make too, though? And I think it's one thing to value a contribution. I think it's another thing that we value ourselves based off of our contribution. You remember the high school projects you got put in? The team project? 5 people in there. Maybe you were the one who was like just riding everybody else's coattails, right? But most people, they're like, I want to be the contributor. I want to help. I want to do it. And you got bugged by the person who was going to get the same grade as you but did half the work. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, I know some of you still call that work today. Like that's your work business. Like you get on projects and on teams and you're covering everybody else's stuff and yet you're all getting the bonus for it or the credit for it. I think there's moments in life where we measure our value by our accomplishments. And I think it actually goes against the secret sauce of what makes community life great together. We'll get there in just a moment. Here's a 5th thing. Jesus tells them in chapter 17, verse 22, he says, listen, he's very brief about this. He just says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and on the 3rd day, he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. He tells them, I'm going to die. And I'm going away. And they're filled with grief. But somewhere in the midst of grief, this is almost right before the disciples ask the question, so who's the greatest in the kingdom? I think one of the things they're asking is, Jesus, when you're gone, who's in charge? Because if I'm not in charge, then that's fine. I just need to know my role. I need to know my status. But if Peter's in charge, Lord, please don't let it be him. But if he is in charge, like we just need to know that like you've given us the orders, we're gonna follow his lead. I remember after college, I just needed a summer off, and so I went to this camp, and I lifeguarded. And that was I had to sit in the sun, and as long as no one drowned, I was good, right? That was my job. It was me and one other person that were lifeguarding. We had this supervisor who would check in on us like every 4th day or something like that. It was just a very loose thing. 2 days after being there and just kind of trying to feel this whole new experience out, I asked my supervisor the question. I was like, so who's actually in charge? Like, I have one partner who's a gal, and then there's me. Is she in charge of me, or am I in charge of her? Like, who's taking point on this? And I just remember him looking at me like, who cares? Just go down there and don't let people drown. Like, that's all I care about. Like, but there's something in me that said, I need to know who's in charge. And I don't know if it's like, I had to know if I was in charge, therefore I would act differently or contribute more. Or if I wasn't in charge, that, well, it's not my responsibility. I'm just running my shift. And like, however the pool gets cleaned, it's not my job, right? Because she's in charge, right? A lot of us, we function that. We just want to know, like, who's in charge. Now, pecking order matters. I mean, lines of authority are important. But I think sometimes we get overly fixated on status. What's that look like in a church? That's the pastor's job. That person's a director. They get paid for that. Or, man, if I could get that title of community group leader, or if I could get on that leadership team, and we get overly fixated on status, And sometimes it's an unhealthy view of, hey, someone needs to be in charge, and I just want to know who it is. I think the disciples are in this moment asking this question, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And what it's revealing is that Jesus has built this foundation of, follow me. I'm going to teach you to do what I do. And when I leave, you're going to be able to take my place. But there's cracks in the foundation. The cracks are filled with insecurity, selfishness, pride, and they lack the secret sauce. And if Jesus doesn't correct it, this is not going to turn out well. And so here's what Jesus does. When you ask Jesus a question, just be prepared. He probably won't give you a straightforward answer, all right? So here's what he does. Verse 2, here's the answer to who's the greatest. He called a little child to him, and he placed the child among them. He creates an object lesson. The object is the child. Think 4-year-old at this point, okay? And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children. Now listen to this. These guys have been following around for a couple years, and he looks at the disciples like, okay, you see this 4-year-old? You need to change and be more like this 4-year-old. I love it when Jesus creates object lessons because sometimes we don't know exactly what he's talking about. And for the last 2,000 years, a lot of scholars have spilled a lot of ink trying to figure out what that statement means. Well, how do I become like a 4-year-old? Let me finish reading what he says. I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I can see Peter going, Jesus, just to clarify, we didn't ask you how we got into heaven. We asked you who's the greatest in heaven. Jesus is like, you don't get it. We need to back up because you forgot how you joined this group. You didn't join on your merit. You didn't join because you were the smartest in your rabbinical school. You were fishermen. Sorry for the fishermen in the room, okay? You were fishermen. You weren't the most educated. You weren't the kindest. You spoke like sailors. He said, I didn't pick you because of how great you were. I picked you because it was my choice. I picked you because it was me who selected. So here's his first point. To enter heaven, one must have the humility of a child by depending on God's atonement. That just means this, that God purchased your life on a cross through Christ to rescue you, as opposed to depending on one's own merit. 4-year-old. What are they going to eat that day? Whatever mom and dad makes them. What are they going to wear that day? Whatever mom and dad picked out. Where are they going to sleep? Wherever mom and dad say to. A 4-year-old is 100% dependent on their parent to care for them. And Jesus says, see this little kid? I want you to have that kind of humility where you depend on God like he depends on his parents. But he's not talking about who's the greatest. He's just saying, just to get into heaven, it is solely based off what God did for you in Jesus on the cross, not because you're the smartest, best, or creative, or accomplished kid. A 4-year-old isn't accomplished. Best he can hope to do is stop picking his nose, right? None of us got into heaven by our merit or because we deserved it. Jesus died on that cross, which is what he's pointing to. Jesus died on that cross solely because of God's mercy, grace, and love for us. And he tells those disciples that have been with him for 2 years, he says, listen, here's what you need to do. You need to change because you don't have the secret sauce of even entering the kingdom of heaven. You think you're concerned about who's the greatest. This should make us all uncomfortable. You should be a little bit more concerned about just getting in. There's 2 kinds of people in this world, those who are humble and those who are about to be. And they're humbled at this point. You know what dependent kids say to their parents? They say, I need you. They look at their mom and dad and they say, I need you, because that's the reality. They need their parents. You know what? That's probably one of the greatest prayers you could ever pray to God. God, I need you. There's no way based off of the holiness of my own life that I'm getting in. I need your forgiveness. I need the payment that Jesus made on the cross for me. I need that because there's no way I'm getting in. By the way, Jesus just doesn't stop there. He moves on. He then says, verse 4, he says, therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child. And right near lowly, if you're in a paper Bible, I want you to do this. Just write the word humble. because that's actually what the Greek word means. It's more than lowly. It's whoever takes the humble position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Here's how I put it. It's point number 2. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the one who daily lives in humble dependence on God, as opposed to living as an independent adult. Here's what I mean. When you're a kid and you depend on your parents for everything, the sign of adulthood is what? Autonomy, right? I don't need them to pay for my cell phone bill. I don't need them to live under a roof. I have my own roof. I don't need them for gas money. I don't need them for a job. I'm independent from my parents. I love them. They love me, but I no longer need them to care for me. And somehow we translate that into a spiritual world that says, I'm a mature spiritual person when I no longer need God to help me. What you're saying is that you on your best day are better than God on his worst day. Me on my best day? I don't even come close to God on his worst day empowering me to do the things he's called me to do. You know what humble people say who are spiritually mature? They say, God, I need you. Not just for salvation. I mean daily today. God, in my family, to build the kind of family that you want me to build, I need you. God, for me to go to work and represent you well in this valley, I need you. God, for me to represent you to my neighbors, for me to have an influence where I might one day lead my neighbor to Christ, where I might lead one of my parents to Christ, for me to really be a disciple maker in this community, God, I need you, because me on my best day, I can't do that. The spiritually mature are not autonomous and independent. The spiritually mature are absolutely dependent upon God's presence and his power. Dang it, that's a good time to say amen. And he finishes with this third point. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Here's how I put it. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven welcomes and serves the humble and the vulnerable. Who's the greatest? The greatest one among you first is considering it to be very privileged just to enter heaven. They have that kind of humility. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven is somebody who humbly just depends on God to be a great follower of him. The one who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven turns around and looks at the vulnerable and looks at those who are struggling, looks at the 4-year-old and says, how can I serve you? How can I help you? Now, Matthew later clarifies this. Jesus, he goes, if you turn to Matthew 23 real quick, it's in your notes, it'll be on the screen here. Jesus clarifies it, and Matthew makes sure that none of us miss it. He doesn't create an object lesson, he just states it unbelievably plainly. Here's what it says. The greatest among you, that was the question, right? Who's the greatest? The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What is the secret sauce to community life together where God empowers it? It's humility. It was no secret at all. Jesus said it again and again. You want to be great? You want to be a part of an unbelievable community with God's dynamic power among you? You want to be a great church in San Jose? The secret sauce is humility. Jesus goes on to give another object lesson. He puts a towel around his waist and straps another one over his arm the night before he's arrested. And he goes and he starts washing his disciples' feet. And Peter goes, no, why are you doing that? I should be washing your feet. You're the great rabbi. You're the Son of God. Remember, Jesus, I told you that that's who you were. Remember when I got that right? Jesus is like, you don't get it. The greatest among us is the servant. And so he washes Peter's feet. He washed all their feet. He washes Judas's feet, the least deserving. And even in Jesus' worst moment, I mean, think about it. He's going to go to the cross. He knows he's going to the cross. But when he's going to the cross, he's washing the disciples' feet. Jesus is arrested in the garden, and there's a conflict that breaks out, a quick fight. I think it's Peter who slices off the ear of one of these servants, and Jesus is like, no, this is not how I'm going out. And he heals that man. Listen, Jesus is getting arrested, and he's still caring for the servant who came with his enemies. Jesus is dying on the cross. He could be solely focused on himself, but he saves the criminal next to him before he dies. He's suffering. And yet in that moment, he cries out to his mother and John. He says, "Mother, this is your son. Son, this is your mother." He's just saying, "Take care of my mom." He's thinking about his mom in the moment that he's dying on the cross. He's dying. He's being murdered on a cross, and he still declares these words, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." All of this flows from the heart of Jesus, that he models humility to us. He wasn't concerned about status, but he served people around him. The secret sauce to community life together, it's life together and you fight together, but you stay together, is humility amongst one another. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to study our way through Matthew 18, one chapter, take us 4 weeks. I invite you to do this. Would you read it this week? Read Matthew 18 this week. Read it a couple times. See what God shows you. Humility is throughout the entire chapter, even though the word is only mentioned once. And if you're reading the NIV, it's that low position. That's where the word humility shows up. Here it is. Humility looks at the face of God and says, "God, I need you. I need you to save me and rescue me." Humility looks at God and says, "I don't just need you the day that I was saved. I actually need you every day to be the man or the woman that you called me to be. God, I need you to have the marriage that you want me to have. God, I need you every day to be the parent that I'm supposed to be. God, I need you every day to be the employee, to be the neighbor that you want me to be." Humility says, "God, I need you." But listen to this. In a community, if you're going to have the kind of humility or the kind of community that really people long to be a part of, you know what humility says? Humility says, "I need you." Not based off your accomplishments, not based off your contributions, not based off how skilled you are, how good you look, or squeaky clean your life is. Humility does this. It just looks at each other and says, "I need you. I need you in my community group. I need you to belong to my life. I need you to help me. I need you to be a part of my life." The Christian life was not meant to be lived alone. It was meant to be lived in community. But we resist thinking that independence is the sign of maturity, and it's a joke. Independence from each other is not the sign of maturity. That's the sign of pride. Pride and humility have no place together. How do we do as a church at that? Is there joy and life and longevity? We got longevity, 167 years this year. That's how long this church has been around. A couple months longer than California's been a state. Came to church in wagons. Put some context to this. But even in longevity, there haven't been years of joy. There hasn't always been peace. This hasn't always been a place of life where people wanted to come to and be like, "Oh, I got to belong to that." Yesterday, I saw it. I saw a glimpse of it on Friday night when I watched people walk through these doors and you loved on them, encouraged them, and served them. I saw it Saturday morning at a trailer park right down here where people were helped and served and loved on. And I saw it over on the east side over here where a team of you went and loved and served on for a group of people there. There was humility all over the place. Say, "I don't care what task you have for me. I'll get dirty. I'll do it just to serve somebody else." This church has so much unbelievable potential of you right now. We can be the kind of community that God's called us to be. But the secret sauce to it is humility. Can you honestly declare, "God, I need you to save me. God, I need you every day of my life." And can you look at other people and say, "No, I need you to be a part of this. Because I'll be the man that God calls me to be if I'm in relationship with you. I need your help." Hey, let's bow our heads and let's pray. I'm just wondering if we can pray that same thing. If you and I together can just pray this, "God, I need you." So let's close our eyes for just a moment. And I'd love it if you would put these into your own words. And maybe some of you, you've never given your life to Christ. And maybe today's the day. You're like, "Jesus died for me out of humility and love. I can't pay for my own sins, but yet God has already paid for them myself." And maybe today's the day that you're going to say, "Yes, I accept that. God, I need you. If you've already prayed that prayer, maybe your prayer is, God, I need you every day. And you need to put that into your own words. And maybe real specifically, God, I need you in this conflict that I'm having. God, I need you in this place where I'm angry. God, I need you in this. And just call out to God and tell him where you need him today. And so let's do this. Let's pause for just a minute. As I pray, you pray. And if you need to pray a faith prayer of just, Jesus, I've never said yes to you, and today I'm just declaring I need you, then pray that prayer. God, we need you. Those are the words. That's the declaration of your people. Not just once do we need you every day. On my best day, I fall short, God. But with your power and your presence in my life is amazing. So God, thank you. Work humility into our church, Lord. Work it in. And as we do that, God, I pray that our church becomes an unbelievably attractive, healthy, vibrant place where people will come and wonder what's different, and will simply say this: it's Jesus. That you showed us humility, and we're just trying to live it out. One more quick prayer before we leave. Can you honestly say that the people in your life right now, that you could look them in the face and say, I need you? And maybe you need to send an email or a text or have a face-to-face and just let them know, hey, I love you and I need you. Because not everybody senses that. Sometimes we feel expendable in our community. Maybe you'd look at somebody today and just say, I need you. So pray that to Jesus. Jesus, I pray that you would show me all the people in our church that, man, I could easily look at 100 different people and say, oh, I need you. I can't do that. I need you to step into leadership. I need you to be a part of that community. I need you to lead this. Or I need you to have conversation. I just need you as a friend. And so, God, we just declare that today, that we need you and we need these people. Help us to grow in humility. Instead of ending this prayer, can I ask you to stand for just a moment? And I want you to sing this song as a prayer and a declaration of what you believe about God.